It's a lot of really big with the markets. And the name of the one, we'll figure it out. Those are scouts.
Oh, but it didn't say anything about that in the book.
All right.
They, Americans weren't.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So for those who might need a little extra hearing help, we do have, we have 2 more devices, sets of headphones if you need it. But it's good to see so many people here tonight, so many friendly faces. And I'm glad that this is something we can all work on and learn together. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Voelkel. I'm the curator here at the Klamath County Museum. And this is something that I felt like we need to do for a long time. And so it's good to finally be able to do this. And so we're happy to see how much interest is in these programs. And we hope that that interest continues to build in the community because we really want this thing to be known, this story. And so we put in a lot of work to make sure that these programs are going to be the best they can be. And so in giving this first presentation of this lecture series, I'm going to give an overview of what you have to look forward to in the coming months. First off, this series was conceived as a way to bring this conflict back into public memory. This war, well, let me ask this question here. How many of you feel like you know the story of this war very well? Not a single hand. Okay, there's one. Okay. So we all have a lot to learn, myself included. So this war was the definitive moment in the history of Eastern Oregon. It changed everything. And no other conflict was so consequential in how the state was later settled and everything that came after. And despite this fact, somehow it's been moved entirely out of the reaches of our collective memory. And for some, this wasn't done intentionally, but rather maybe it's because so many of those who were engaged in it, at least on the American side, didn't really stick around in Oregon. For others, for those who were not necessarily on the most positive side of this, it was probably intentionally done in some cases, intentionally forgotten to deal with the trauma. So in the coming months, we'll have the opportunity to hear from subject experts, including military historians, cultural and language experts, and most importantly, tribal members. Each of our speakers will provide the best information available, and each is uniquely qualified to participate in this. And we hope, like I said before, we hope these programs will carry into the fall, with each one, at least one occurring each month until then. This series was made possible with the generous help of the Klamath County Museum Foundation. We're very, very grateful for them, and they provide the funding to bring in the best of the best. And if any of you are interested in helping further these free programs, donations are very much appreciated. There's a QR code in the program, I believe, if you'd like to do that. And because of you, we can reach an even larger audience. So with that, let's begin. My portion tonight is going to be a Snake War 101. So you're going to be getting a bit of an information dump from me really quick. And hopefully when we get to Dr. Carpenter, he'll be able to help you start smoothing out the bumps. But yeah, this is a crash course in Snake War history here. All right. My dear parents, The snow is so deep on the mountains that the stages can't run. In fact, pack mules can't push through it, and the only mails that come through are brought on the backs of men who walk on snowshoes. Tomorrow we will send a mail by way of Harney and Columbia River, which you will receive long before the previous ones. I'll repeat what I've said in former letters, that Jim has sent his application to Washington to be stationed east of the Mississippi River. With all due allowance for delays and deliberation, he hopes to hear from it in July or August at furthest. Though I'm prepared for disappointment, I have plenty of hope. We're experiencing magnificent weather and the snow has nearly disappeared and the trees are full of birds. Indians are giving great trouble, killing settlers, stealing stock, etc. Do not venture near our post in daylight, but at night they often shoot arrows into our corral and have already killed 16 mules. Whenever the troops go after them, they all hide in the stronghold of Steens Mountain. General Crook, with 3 or 4 companies from here in Harney, have been out for several weeks on a scout, but he returned rather unsuccessful. They killed 13 Indians, nearly all they could find. He is going out again. This persecution of the Indians goes against the grain with me. I think it is a wretched, unholy warfare. The poor creatures were hunted down like wild beasts and shot down in cold blood. The same ball shot went through a mother and her baby at her breast. One poor little creature, just the size of my baby, was shot because he would someday grow up. It makes me sick. And all for the few grains of gold that tempt the cupidity and avarice of grasping men. The land is wretched. In fact, the fact is acknowledged that this country will never be good for anything but its mineral resources. And therefore, this race of human beings, which God has created and given their place on earth, must be crushed to the bitter end. I do not believe such an enterprise will ever be blessed, and I think that Indian depredations are a just retribution on their persecutors. Well, I will change the subject. This is one on which I feel strongly, and I may say too much. This letter was written by Julia Gillis, the wife of Captain James Gillis. And she wrote it in 1868 during the 4th year of the Snake War. It's a glimpse into the horror of a war that was being waged without rules and without remorse. Got ahead of my PowerPoint here. Let's see. Jump ahead here. That's Camp Warner where she was living at the time. That's over by Lakefield. Sorry about that. Okay. Still not good. About 2 into it. All right. So a little bit of who, what, when, and where the conflict. So who was involved? It was a war waged against the Americans, against the Northern Paiutes, Bannocks, and Western Shoshones. And it was widespread conflict, but it went all the way from our area here, all the way into Idaho. Some people argue that it went as far as Utah. And all the way from up towards the Columbia River and down into Nevada. So it was a big ordeal. And the official dates for this conflict are 1864 to 1868, though that can also be expanded out. And as I said, it was in Oregon, California, Nevada, and Idaho. Okay, now let me give you a bit of a map here so you can get an idea of that. That whole area there was the theater of the war. So very large.
But the Snake River's just up at the top of it.
Okay, I'll hold this closer. All right, is that better?
Yes.
All right. So, this war, we'll talk about that a little bit, but the war or the term snake has nothing to do with the Snake River. So, snake was a derogatory term that was given to the tribes in the area. And it was more or less a blanket term. And it was, even for a time, assigned to the Klamaths and Modocs, because the Army didn't really know. And so they were calling everybody snakes at the time. But to give you an idea of just what it looked like in Oregon, these stars that you see on the map are the sites of military posts that were built to fight the tribes. Just in Oregon, there are more in California and in Nevada. Now, this next, when I hit the button here, you'll see a bunch of little red marks come up, and each of those red marks is where a significant fight happened.
Hi.
Right, there's a lot there, and that's not even all of them. Okay, so this was no simple thing. This was a big deal. Right, and you even see some down really close to where we are. For those of you, I think most of you are from Klamath Falls or Klamath Falls area here. Troops from Fort Klamath were heavily involved in this. All right, so for those of you who were around for the time when I did a presentation on the Modoc War a couple years ago, this is something I stole from my presentation there, but it illustrates what I'm talking about. So the war was, in some ways, in many ways, the product of a young nation that was both unwilling and, in many ways, unable to enforce its own laws. And since the time of British rule, America's westward expansion often defied established laws, federal laws. And early laws barred Americans from entering native lands, and artificial boundaries were put in place to distinguish between the lands of settlers and the lands given to the tribes. So this will illustrate that a little bit. So people arrived, the British set up an artificial boundary at in the Appalachians there. They didn't want any of their colonists to move beyond the Appalachians. Well, Daniel Boone happened. And so the Americans pushed right through it. They didn't listen. And so once the American government was in charge, they decided to set up another, what they called permanent Indian frontier. And so, let's see here. There's the permanent Indian frontier there, that line is about at the Mississippi River. And people still push through. And again, this was, at the time, it was all against the law. They weren't supposed to do this. But anytime the Army tried to enforce it, it was either half-hearted or they just weren't. They didn't have the manpower to do it. So there you go, the settlement of Texas there. Then the settlement of Oregon completely blew that out of the water. There's no more space for an Indian frontier, nowhere else to put them. And so now the solution became reservations. And that is something that had been tried before, and but now it became the official policy. Since we don't have anywhere to push them, anywhere else to push them to out at the frontier, we're going to group them together, was the thought. Okay. So in the case of the Snake War, the conflict conflict came as the Oregon and California trails accelerated contact between Native peoples and immigrants. And so this inevitably brought bloodshed as immigrants were passing through Native lands, they would consume a lot of the resources that were being used, and it was stuff that the natives really needed. They depended on. They couldn't survive without these resources, and so to try to survive, they would steal cattle, steal supplies, and violence just escalated from there. And it also happened to be that in a lot of these areas where the immigrants were coming through and settling, the tribes had to be territorial. That's what they had to do to survive. And they had conflicts between themselves and other tribes, and those were usually short, sharp affairs. And as immigrants entered these lands, they were unwittingly entering that kind of conflict and that competition. And down the see, so these are newspaper clippings from an attack that happened on the Oregon Trail, just on the Idaho side of the state line. This is called the Ward Massacre, and it nearly started a war of extermination against the tribes in this area. And it was such big news that it went all the way to England. So the newspaper on the right, you see, is from Southampton, England. Okay, and down this way in the Klamath Basin, the early 1850s saw conflicts and massacres between the Modocs and immigrants. And because of this, the Army and territorial militia from Oregon began patrolling the Applegate Trail all the way from Jacksonville down to the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada. At the time, it was still Utah territory. Though the primary target for the militia was the Modoc people, they attacked whatever village they ended up coming across. And that included the villages of Paiutes in Oregon and in Nevada. So these indiscriminate attacks destroyed whatever trust was left between the Paiutes and Shoshones and the Americans. And further to the north, this is a picture from the 1870s, but further to the north, the Warm Springs tribes were given a reservation in 1855. And according to some accounts, it was almost entirely in Paiute territory. And the Warm Springs were the traditional enemies of the Paiutes. Now that they were confined to a reservation, that made them sitting ducks for attacks. And so the Paiutes would make these raids with near impunity. And but in one of those raids, 2 Paiute leaders were captured. They were brothers. Their names were Wiawiwa and Paulina. They eventually escaped, and each one was left with scars from the shackles that they were held in. And both feature prominently as we get further into this. So conflicts along the trails continued to lead to massacres, and massacres led to bloody seesaw violence. And the Army began active operations against the Paiutes in Oregon and Nevada in 1860. And the Paiutes, they defeated the Army in Nevada, but not much changed in Oregon. And that wasn't the last word in Nevada either. Everything changed, though, once Americans began establishing permanent settlements in the region. There's a picture of Paulina there. That photo was actually taken at Fort Klamath. Okay, this is the town of Silver City in Idaho. It was founded in 1864. And when this city was established, it was still dangerous to go outside the town limits. There's quite a few newspaper accounts of people who would go off by themselves and be found killed later on. So these cities were built in native land, and and the natives were fighting back. And Idaho wasn't the only place where these were built, where these cities were being built. You had California, Oregon, Nevada, it was everywhere. And these permanent settlements were usually set up in the most rich territories for the tribes, and it cut off those precious resources. And so, again, bloodshed followed. And in 1864, Civil War volunteer troops began active operations against the Paiutes and Shoshones. This is considered the start of the Snake War. Once the troops got involved, the bloodshed skyrocketed, though it was mostly on the part of the natives who were being killed. In what seemed like countless attacks and skirmishes, just remember that map I showed you. The war slogged on, but it was overshadowed by the larger civil war that was going on back east. And one of the primary Paiute leaders in this conflict was Paulina. And so he's one of those guys who really became a sort of boogeyman to the white settlers. They were terrified of Paulina because he was so quick and devastating in his attacks. And so everybody here knew him. And an interesting thing about Paulina is that there's probably more features named about him in Oregon than any other person who lived here. So, but in 1864, let's see how far off of my presentation I am. Okay, I'm right on. Okay. So in 1864, J.W. Parent Huntington, the Oregon Superintendent of Indian Affairs, came down this way in hopes of making a treaty with the Klamaths, Modocs, and Paiutes for as many Paiutes as he could possibly get. And while there was a strong turnout for the Klamaths and Modocs, very few Paiutes came. The ones who came were mostly the Yapatika or the Choctaw Band. And as a result of the talks, a huge chunk of Southern Oregon and Central Oregon was ceded to the United States. And included in that land cession was thousands of square miles of Paiute territory. And as Huntington traveled north after the treaty, his party came across a Paiute camp. And in it was the wife and son of Paulina. And Huntington captured them and took them back to Fort Vancouver to be held as hostages until Paulina surrendered himself. And soon after, Paulina did surrender himself at Fort Klamath. And that's when that picture was taken of him. And Huntington returned. And next year, in 1865, they signed another treaty, the Treaty of 1865, sometimes called the Snake Treaty. And so Paulina agreed to live on the reservation. Huntington went back to Salem, but Paulina did the best he could on the reservation. And he lived about where Beatty is today. But even with him on the reservation, the war continued. There were just so many Paiutes who did not come onto the reservation. So the war continued, troops fought and massacred bands of Paiutes in the area. And finally, in February 1866, he left the reservation because, according to at least one informant, he was unwilling to do nothing while his people were slaughtered. Paulina was later tracked down and killed by ranchers in 1867, and his scalp was nailed to a barn for everyone to see. And in 1866, that was a year of significant change in the war. Another close-up of Paulina here. Okay, 1866 was the year after the Civil War ended, and many of the experienced and battle-hardened troops that had been involved in the Civil War, they were being shipped to the West. And one of these officers who came over was George Crook. George Crook was an experienced Indian fighter, as he called himself, and He even had a arrowhead lodged in his hip that healed over. He got in a fight with some pit rivers down near Fall River Mills. And but he was also very experienced in scorched earth warfare. He had helped lead the campaign to transform the agriculturally rich Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, to a barren wasteland. And he brought that type of warfare here. Crook's style of warfare was different from any other used at that up to that point in the war. It was a constant warfare, a year-round warfare, and really a war without end. Another change was in 1866 was the recruitment of Warm Springs warriors to serve with the Army. This picture was taken during the Modoc War when they were once again called into service. But many of those who served in the Modoc War were veterans from the Snake War unit. So this unit of warriors was formed with the sole purpose of killing as many Paiutes as possible, and to do so without any kind of discrimination. Their orders were to kill every man, woman, and child they found. And though they protested these orders, they followed them. And military and political leaders alike, including the governor of Oregon, who was the one who insisted that they not take any prisoners, praised them for their work. Meanwhile, Crook's men raged across the high desert, and they destroyed village after village. And for a time, they even entered the Klamath Reservation while they were hunting for Paiutes in this direction. And it's interesting to note that they were being guided by Shoshone scouts. Shoshones, some Shoshone bands were involved fighting against the Army, but these Shoshones were willing to work with the Army to help track down their relatives in this war. It's a sad affair. And this warfare continued until the summer of 1868, when Crook received word that Weawewa, the brother of Paulina, was ready to surrender. Crook met with the chief at Camp Harney near present-day Burns, and there the Paiutes surrendered, effectively ending the war, but not their suffering. And to end on kind of a cliffhanger, we'll talk about that more later. Yeah, but so one historian who's written on the war calculated that the death toll of the war was around 1,700 people killed. That number alone is more than any other Indian war fought in the West, including any of the wars against the Lakota and Little Bighorn and all that. This dwarfs that. That historians figure didn't account for those who died of exposure and starvation in Crook's year-round campaigning. And so contemporary reports suggest that number may be higher, close to 4,000 who ended up perishing. But whatever it is, we'll probably never know the true toll. But we do know that this was absolutely devastating. But this opened up all of Eastern Oregon for settlement, and things haven't been the same since. And despite these extraordinary trials that the Paiute people endured, today there's still many who remain here and live throughout the region who are here in this room with us now. And I'm so grateful that they're here with us. And I hope that we can learn together about this as we go. But their survival really is a testament to the determined perseverance of their ancestors in the face of incredible hardship. So thank you. And that's the end of mine. So we're going to swap it over now to Dr. Marc Carpenter. It'll be a minute while we get this figured out, though. So just bear with us for a minute. It's our first time trying it like this on a YouTube Live. All right. You hear us all right, Dr. Carpenter?
I can hear you all right. How's my sound?
It's good. Let me turn it up a bit. All right. We're good to
Right.
go.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I want to start by saying I do really wish I could be there in person. The timing just didn't work out. I do work in North Dakota most of the year these days, and even when I'm lucky enough to be in Oregon, as I am right now, I don't have a car in this state, and it's quite a trip down to where y'all are. But I wish I could be there in person. I got to see the reflection of the audience briefly in the TV, but it does feel very odd presenting as this sort of giant Oz head without seeing the audience. So do let me know if I've gone wrong. Because I won't be able to tell it from audience perspectives. I have a few things I want to share about myself and kind of about where I'm coming from with this history before I switch over to a slide deck with too many words on it, because I do have that sort of habit as a historian. First of all, I want to kind of recognize I am not an Indigenous person, and it's always a little bit awkward when you're speaking to Indigenous history as not that, hey, there's an audience. Hello, it's wonderful to see you. In fact, I do have ancestry on the other side. I have ancestry that goes back to the invasion period of the 1850s. And so I'm kind of reckoning with that as part of reckoning with my work. The other thing I want to mention before I get started with the slides proper is that there's kind of the classic thing historians answer every question with is it's complicated. I'll probably do that at least once in a Q&A period. And it is complicated because I'm digging into a book that I struggled to get down to 400 pages that I want to speak to you about in a way that's cogently and hopefully interesting in a relatively short amount of time. I will do my best to speak slower. Thank you for the note. I appreciate it. So I'm only going to be touching on some parts of that book, and I'm only going to be touching on some parts of the so-called Snake War, particularly the early years of it, which are the period that I know better. One of the things I've learned as I've tried to study this in more detail is that there's a lot more study of it that is still needed. There's not a lot of good resources out there yet, and I'm excited about this series bringing more of that to light. But, you know, I too am still learning the edges of it, even as one of the hopefully attempting to be experts, right? This is a story that is still frequently unknown and suppressed, even among potential experts. So with that, I'm going to start attempting to share my PowerPoint. We'll see how that works. I am also working with the joy of trying to figure out how all of this goes. Let me see what I've got here. Okay. Okay. And I assume maybe give me a little sign wave. Can you see it okay? Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Thank you so much. So I am here in part to share with you a book that I just had published this last year. I was working on it for about a decade before it came out last year, so it does feel strange to have it out there in the world. And it is a book largely about the wars of the 1850s. So I kind of call them collectively the War on Illinois, which did spread throughout Oregon and Washington, from southern Oregon down through California, up through what's now Washington, up into parts of Vancouver, BC. And it is a book both kind of retelling the stories of those wars with a lot of new evidence, particularly evidence from the people who fought in them on both sides, and particularly evidence from those who perpetrated war crimes on the American side. So what they themselves said they did. And it's a history of how that kind of horrific story did get erased and sometimes covered up over time. And I do use that word cover up advisedly, right? One of the things, many of my sources are historians, and historians keep all their papers, and they would write to one another saying, we don't talk about this part of the war. We don't talk about that part of the war. I know that they did this horrible thing, but we're not going to put that in the book. So when I say cover up, I mean they knew what had happened and made a deliberate choice to tell a different story. There is a chapter in this book on the early years of the Snake War, and one of the things I want to do today is connect this kind of earlier wars of the 1850s to what's going on in the Snake War. I think it helps us understand what happened in the 1860s to understand where a lot of people were coming from in the 1850s. So here's kind of the big idea of the book, written up again with a little too much text, probably a bad habit of a historian, that the small forgotten wars of the Pacific Northwest, things like the Rogue River War, the Yakima War, the Puget Sound War, the Walla Walla War, many others, some of which audience members may be familiar with, some of which you may not, were to the people who were in them, both to the Americans who were invading and to many of the native communities who were defending, the same war, right? They were all wars for land that were connected in the people who fought in them. And I looked through the veterans' records of American veterans of the Indian Wars, and what they said they fought in was not the Yakima War, the Rogue River War, the Snake War. They said they fought in the Indian Wars, and they grouped them all together in their own recollections. And as I mentioned, there was a slow and evolving cover-up of the violence, lethality, what was considered at the time war crimes, what we would now call genocide of those wars. And it was slow in part because some Americans who took part in them wanted to be celebrated for their acts of genocide. And that too left behind a record. A lot of my sources are people saying what they themselves did to men, women, and children in the taking of the Pacific Northwest, because they thought that made them more pioneer than anyone else. It was only a little bit later that there was often very successful work to cover up that evidence and tell a different story of how Oregon and Washington came to be. I didn't think when I started this project that it was going to take more than a decade. I thought it would be a shorter book. I wasn't yet a doctor of history. I thought I could get a shorter project. It kind of happened to me. At first, I thought it would be a book about the two mass killings that were at their time famous. The Lupton Massacre of 1855, a little bit north up in Little Butte Creek, which was once famous. It was once nationally known because it started a lot of warfare in that region of what's now Oregon after a territorial delegate attacked a group of Takelma and Shasta people after promising them in peace. And then a counterattack led to a spiral of violence. And there was a somewhat similar, in terms of the number of people killed, the dozens of people killed, mass killing up in Northwest Washington, south of Seattle, the Maxton Massacre of Nisqually people, which was similarly very well known at the time. You could reference it in the newspapers and people would know what you were talking about without mentioning any specifics, but is now largely unknown and has been since the early 1900s. So I thought at first it would be a history of how these particular events had slowly faded from historical recollection. What I found as I had dug more and more into the records, and I have gone through literally a couple 100,000 pages of pioneer reminiscences, stories, volunteer military diaries, what the people who fought in this said they did and what they wanted remembered about it, is that these were not by any means the only killings of that scale. There were several, as was already mentioned, in the Snake War. There were several in the Yakima War, and there were some that didn't happen under the auspices of any particular war. I didn't anticipate when I started this that I would end up needing to name massacres, because most of the massacres that have remained in historical memory have remained there because indigenous people have continually tried to remind the United States that these things occurred, and not every massacre left behind survivors. I ended up having to name a massacre after a librarian named Urban Hicks because he killed everybody in his massacre, and so there wasn't somebody left alive on the indigenous side to tell the story. And as I dug more and more into pioneer archives, I found that this kind of violence was a norm. Not every pioneer took part. Some pioneers absolutely disagreed with it, right? You heard a primary source quotation about that at the beginning of the previous presentation. But the knowledge that this was done or was going to be done was everywhere. It's in letters, it's in diaries, it's in political campaigns. I found candidates for Oregon governor bragging about mass killings and sexual violence on the campaign trail as a means of getting votes. I found acts of violence from the leaders of Oregon and Washington Territory, from territorial judges, from governors. Governor Joseph Lane, who is the namesake of the county where I got my PhD, would, before he returned to the Senate, go off, quote, hunting Indians, and would write into the newspaper about how many he had killed before he went back east to DC. I also found it from everyday pioneers, from interpreters, from trappers, from ingenues, from young women, from judges, from sheriffs, from gold miners, of course, but also from everyday miners, camps guarded by excitable 12-year-olds hoping to do a killing. And this was widely known at the time. I think sometimes we struggle to kind of wrap our heads around how this wasn't just a few violent people. This was a culture of violence. I think one of the ways of getting at that is actually getting at the origins of the term pioneer, which I think in more recent years we associate with the sort of positive valence of discovery, of innovation. And I love innovation. Innovation is great. Its original kind of meaning, the word that originally comes from a military term, from pioneer, the soldiers who go in advance of the army. It's still used that way in military circles. I have a cousin who tried to get into a pioneer unit when he was serving. He didn't actually qualify, but he wanted to get into the bridge building unit. Many pioneers in the 1800s understood the word pioneer to mean military action, to mean violence. When they talked about what a real pioneer was, they meant somebody who did violence before the soldiers did. That's part of how they defined who did and did not count as a pioneer in the early days, was whether you had been here during the Indian Wars or not. It's only in the 1900s that there was a norm of ignoring the violent roots of the word and of the idea. And as I mentioned, there was not agreement on what to do about the violence that was used to seize Oregon. Some people wanted it forgotten. Some people wanted to blame it on a violent fringe. The Lupton massacre I briefly mentioned was perpetrated by an elected territorial delegate named James Lupton. Early histories that chose to talk about it all described him as a packer from out of town. He'd literally been elected, right, by the people of Jacksonville, but he was described as a packer from out of town because they wanted to make it just the actions of a fringe few. Several tried to deny historical reality in public while acknowledging it in private. Elwood Evans, the man kind of on the man with the full beard, for example, worked for years to deny the reality of the Maxon Massacre successfully. It was largely deleted from Washington history, while acknowledging that it absolutely happened in his private letters. And because of that mix of public and private, there was a lot of evidence left over for me to find when I'm telling a story that, again, is pretty far at odds with a lot of how we've told Oregon history in the past. The only real constant I found was that pioneers had to be considered heroic in these histories, right? And those first generations of historians would write to one another about how they needed to, quote, rake up no old stories of evil. And that meant that in a very good way, Americans started to become less and less comfortable with the level of violence that had been used to seize the West. What counted as evil expanded, what kinds of killings were covered up or explained away became more and more extensive. Those who loved pioneers more than they loved the truth moved from minimizing or justifying those war acts to simply erasing them over time. I'd also note that a lot of the distortions that were put in there involved not only kind of erasures of acts of violence, but erasures of inciting acts, right? And I do want to really stress, because I think this is relevant to our discussion of the Snake War, counterattacks are not the same as attacks, right? I'm a military historian among other hats, and when we talk about military acts, we do pay attention to who's invading who, right? That is relevant when we talk about military history, who is invading who, but we also pay attention to things like who shoots first, right? And in fact, I've found instances of supposed, quote, Indian attacks on wagon trains, which are in fact Native people defending themselves from settler attacks or striking against direct and specific murders of family members. And I think sometimes we've had this tendency to, again, in this attempts to be sympathetic and even-handed, to move to justifying why Native people might attack settlers. And of course, there are certainly times where Native people did attack settlers out of desperation, out of a feeling of being invaded, but we haven't always moved to considering the evidence for those actual supposed attacks. The evidence for the kind of inciting incident of the famous Ward massacre is unclear, right? We know that there were shots fired, but it is not clear who started what from the evidence that's actually available. And there are some serious questions about kind of the genesis of that famous act. There is a different, more famous in Idaho than Oregon. The Massacre Rocks killings of settlers was provably a response to a settler set of mass murders, where some settlers coming west had murdered men, Shoshone men, women, and children, and then their relatives had come and found the specific wagon train that had did that, passing over those that had not, and attacked them. So what is remembered as a massacre is very much, in that instance, a counterattack. But Counterattack Rocks is not kind of the name of the official historical site. It remains Massacre Rocks, and probably will for a while, even though that story has fundamentally changed once we look at the evidence with fresh eyes. I also sometimes get questions. I have the word genocide in the title of my book, and that is a word you want to be careful about using, right? It can be thrown around loosely, but it is definitely appropriate when we talk about the wars of Oregon in the 1850s and 1860s. It does have a pretty clear legal definition. You can read it yourself. The Genocide Convention, to which the United States agreed after World War II, is not very long. It's only about 3 pages before you get to the signatures. You can read the whole thing, and if you do, you'll be doing better than some newspaper columnists who insist on their national platforms that they have a full idea of what it means and don't seem to have read past about the first paragraph. If you commit an act of genocide, it is defined in the law as an attempt to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group through a variety of acts, including killings, harmings, or inflicting conditions of life that would lead to their destruction. For example, putting them in camps with exposure and insufficient food, if it is done with intent to destroy them in whole or in part, that is a genocidal crime. It's also defined under that law as a crime to attempt genocide, to conspire in it, or to incite it. And that those kinds of acts, and certainly those incitements, were routine in the 1850s and in the 1860s, right, including at the highest levels of state power, as was mentioned. I would also note sometimes people want to define this word as how close or far something is from the most famous and most extensive genocide, the Shoah, or the Holocaust of Jewish people by Nazi Germany, which is part of why this law was created. But this law was created with the ambition not only to prevent another Holocaust, but to end, as the framers of it put, the odious scourge that had been inflicted at all periods of history. And the main author of that law, Raphael Lemkin, did look at, among other things, including, say, the Armenian genocide in Turkey, what had happened in North America as part of his conception of why there needed to be a law like this. I have a couple of quotes up on the screen now. Again, I could show more, as was mentioned. You know, this reaches the higher levels or the low levels. I often end up showing those from military figures because they are the ones with the most direct connections to actions. That was true in the war in Illinois in the 1850s. Not every military figure, but many military figures expressed clear genocidal intent. Whether in the Yakima War, whether in the attacks on the coast, whether perpetrating the Trails of Tears, and that continued into the Snake War. I found a particularly bitter incitement to genocide from a man named Lorne L. Williams in 1865 that is unambiguous in its intent. So I want to make sure I spend the majority of my time on what I've been brought here virtually to speak about, the Snake War, right? And it is a difficult war to define. You'll note even the name is problematic, right? I've put those quotation marks around it for a reason. But it was something that I felt needed to be addressed, even if my book was primarily about these wars in the 1850s, which is part of how people defined pioneer identity in Oregon. But a lot of the same people did a lot of the same crimes for a lot of the same reasons in the Snake War that they had done in the wars of the 1850s, particularly in the early years. It was some of the same perpetrators who I've shown doing acts of violence in the Rogue River region, in the Yakima region, all the way up in Seattle, join up again to try and do the same as part of the Snake War. And like the war on Illinois, it is driven primarily by land hunger. When you look at the people who are planning the American side of the Snake War early, first and foremost, they're talking about land before they talk about anything else. However, there are lots of reasons why it is even less known than those other wars of the 1850s, and was much less written about from the beginning, right? It's not just that it's less known now, it was never well known. One reason for it is that the wars of the 1850s were seen as a dividing marker of pioneer identity, that you were less of a pioneer if you were here after, say, the wars that went into 1857 than if you came before. There was much less of a sense of that for the war of the 1860s. It's also the case that there was less of a financial stake in getting it recognized as a war, because nearly all of the Americans who fought in it were already under the pay of the federal government. And a lot of the reason for really stressing the Indian Wars of the 1850s was to try and get money out of the federal government to pay for them. That was much less of a factor in the Snake War. Again, I mostly focus on those early years where most of the Americans involved in it were pioneer volunteer veterans of the earlier war on Illinois. Just now they had federal uniforms, federal pay, sometimes federal arms. And I do want to note, almost everything written about it is at least a little bit off. I wish I could recommend to you a full book on the Snake War. I cannot. I'm hoping eventually to try and write one. We'll see. I'm hoping to come be there in person to start that research in the next year or two. I was uncomfortable with the name of the war, and I've heard that that's true for many North Paiute folks as well, because it is a slur, right? That word snake does not refer to any Native group, right? I attempted when I first had the book to put snake in quotation marks every time, and the editors at the press really didn't like that, and so they made me take all but one of them out. There's also, as was mentioned, very little agreement on even when it began, in part because American invaders were always ready to do violence for lands. I've seen starting dates 1851, 1854, 1862, 64, 65. Some people will say it's not really the war until Crook's there in 1866. I'm not going to make a call on that, right? But it is, I think, telling that even the basics of what should we call it and when was it are still sort of contested and up for conversation. But I do want to really stress this is a slur, and of course, snake is an insult. It's an insult in many, many cultures. It's been an insult in multiple European cultures. It's an insult in multiple indigenous cultures. There's no such nation as the Snake Indians. I'll mention again, I work in North Dakota now, and the Ocheti Shokoan are frequently known as the Sioux, which comes from Anishinaabe, not a Sioux, or the snakes, right? And that was an insult that they did not choose for themselves initially, right? And it's frequently, as was mentioned, a very portable insult. As he mentioned, it's been used not only against Shoshone, Paiute, and Bannock, but also against Klamath and Modoc. In earlier parts of the 1850s, I saw it deployed against Cayuse, Palouse, Walla Walla peoples. It's a catch-all insult for Native people, and frequently it's used by those who are calling for genocide, or at least for other forms of violence. So I think one of the hopefully strengths of my regional history, of doing a kind of big book that covers 2 full states instead of digging in as in-depth as I would like to in every local story and conflict, is to underline sort of a continuity between them, right? Many of the perpetrators in the Snake War had already done the kind of violence that they did in that war in early wars. And because there's often been an attempt from American pioneers, politicians, and historians to blame Indian wars on the peoples whose land they were invading, it is useful to point out just how early those Americans were planning to try and take land when they could, and that in their own writings, in private, they were often consciously planning to be the aggressors, consciously planning to take land, to plunder livestock, to kill people. They'd done it before, and they would do it again if they could. And there's a lot of distortions that end up very early in the historical record from those attempts to kind of blame wars elsewhere and from attempts to justify. For example, Charles S. Drew, who spent much of the 1850s arguing that American forces could and should commit war crimes when fighting Native people, and attacked men, women, and children in 1855, recognizing those were against the rules of warfare as were typically understood at the time, but arguing that that was the way to be effective, and so Americans should ignore those rules of warfare when it war for Native people for land. By the time of the 1860s, was murdering Native people on flimsy pretexts as a negotiation tactic, including killing some Klamath objectors to the treaty that was mentioned with the Klamath, kind of inventing crimes, but mostly noting that they were against the treaty and then killing them, and also went on campaigns as part of the quote-unquote Snake War. He's also an inveterate liar, right? He's provably lied about a number of things throughout the 1850s and 1860s, and yet a few of his works are still used as sources by historians looking for something, anything written about this war, and not entirely aware of the context of how easily and freely he tells untruths, have kind of leaned on his accounts as accurate. But he, for example, has invented quote-unquote Indian attacks that definitively did not occur as part of his writings, and that needs to be kept in mind when you're interpreting the rest of his writings. Similarly, I had a fascinating time with the Snake War recollection of a man named Big George Freeman, who battled through parts of Eastern Oregon, who claimed in a reminiscence late in life that has been drawn on by at least one other historian, that he'd been in a battle where he'd been severely outnumbered by, quote, Paiute renegades, but his men had won, had killed 17 of them while suffering only 5 deaths, and then, quote, reclaimed 200 head of stock stolen from immigrant wagon trains. And I was able to compare that to the records from his commanding officer at the time, the actual journal of his commanding officer at the time, John Drake. And it looks like, in fact, that battle where he claims to have been outnumbered, Americans actually had more troops than the Paiute. The Americans seem to have shot first. This was an act of American aggression. The Paiute forces had taken at most 3 casualties, not 17. And the supposed stock stolen from immigrant wagon trains was described by John Drake as Indian horses. In other words, what Freeman remembered as reclaiming stock stolen from wagon trains was, in fact, stealing livestock from Paiute peoples. And this occurred elsewhere with other Native groups. One of the things that occurred again and again in my research is how often Americans wanted to go to war with local Native communities, not just for their land, but also for their livestock. When I was reading letters and diaries from those who fought in these wars, one of the reasons they hoped to fight in those wars is so they could steal cows, so they could steal horses, so they could get at the livestock of their native neighbors in addition to their land. Drake's diaries are useful generally, right? It's one of the few kind of day-by-day diaries we currently have. They do hide as well as reveal. And they do have some edges of something well-known Native country, that this invasion was not only murderous and genocidal, but also frequently included acts of sexual violence. Those are seldom talked about directly, even by invaders who are glib about the killings they commit. We know it's everywhere, and again, I have seen evidence that like people brag about it on the campaign trail, but don't want to see it in print. And you can see edges of it in John Drake's records. He writes an account of when he and his men captured a Paiute woman who was stripped of her clothing, her robe, and, quote, handled pretty roughly. And that could be interpreted a couple of ways. but I am afraid it probably should be interpreted that way. She did manage to escape her captors after about 2 days in hell, fleeing into the dead of night without her clothing. I hope she made it. One of the most striking records I found when I was doing this research was a huge autobiography / diary from a man named Loren Lyman Williams, who spent a quarter century as a serial killer of Native people in the West. He left behind about 1,400 pages about his life and his killings. It's sitting in Chicago in a weird dusty corner. And he was, again, a killer for about a quarter century. He landed as part of a kill squad in Port Orford in 1851, and he kept doing it until late in life. Even after he'd retired from other jobs, when he went on vacation to Dakota Territory, he murdered a couple of people while he was there, quote, because he thought they looked like they were going to steal his horse. And I think it's not unreasonable to interpret that, as with his other killings, as something that he did because that's what he saw as his life's work. He wrote about how he loved killing Native people, quote, more than anything else in the world. And he was thus a part of many different wars and conflicts when he was in Oregon, the Rogue River War and the Snake War. Sometimes he was an official U.S. soldier in uniform. Sometimes he was a private citizen. Sometimes he was a state volunteer, where it was unclear whether or not he was an official member of the military or not. He wasn't very good at being a soldier, but he did commit a lot of killings, nonetheless. And he wrote a, I'll say, fascinating order in part of his campaign along the Silvius River and the Malheur in 1865. He was one division among many in the Snake War, where he ordered his men to commit genocide and maybe cannibalism. It's unclear whether this was meant as a joke or whether it was followed through on, but he ordered his men to, quote, every officer must exhaust every means in his power to overtake and punish, I'm going to say the Indians, he used a different word, as they deserve, even subsisting themselves and their men upon wild game, horse flesh, and dead Indians. Depredations and cruelties must cease and treaties be respected, or the more permanent treaty will soon be closed by the extermination of their entire warlike tribes. He wanted to commit genocide. It's worth noting that most of the people he was trying to kill had in fact never signed a treaty. But of course that didn't matter to Loren Williams. He would be just as happy killing those who had signed treaties. And it's worth noting there are both far, far more acts of genocide in Oregon than are typically known or will likely ever be proven. And there are fewer than people like Williams wanted to do. As I mentioned, I've gone through many war diaries of those who fought in the Indian Wars in Oregon, and about half of them have at least one mass killing outside of the bounds of former war. And most of the people who fought in those wars didn't leave behind diaries, which I think leaves a hint to how many more there are where there isn't yet a written record. Williams, for his part, wanted to commit a mass killing. He was not able to achieve that. And in fact, his Silvius River campaign only had one confirmed killing, where he and his men snuck up on an old Paiute fisherman who was actively fishing, apparently had caught a lot of fish. They murdered him, they shot him in the back, and then they ate his fish. And I can't help but think of the family I know where even when they know they should stop, if they're catching, they just keep catching, and wonder about this man. I don't know that I'll ever know more about him than what his murderer wrote, but I hope I do someday. The thing for which Loren L. Williams is known, to the extent he's known, and let me be clear, he is an obscure figure, is what's known as the Silvius River Battle. Early Oregon historians largely did not mention the Snake War. The big early history of Oregon by Hubert Howe Bancroft, actually written by the woman whose credit he stole, Frances Fuller Victor, had the Snake War basically in the footnotes. But the one battle it did describe was a battle that they called the Silvius River Battle, before the kind of arrival of huge numbers of federal troops from further east that was already discussed. And the story that was told in that history and has been repeated in other Snake War books since was that Williams and his men were pursuing two Snake, probably North Paiute men, on foot when suddenly large numbers of native horsemen erupted out of the marsh. There was an hours-long shooting retreat where he and his men killed 15 Paiute men without taking any fatalities, and this was remembered as, quote, the best fighting of the season in 1865. And again, almost every aspect of that is at least a little bit wrong. When I got into the non-official histories, when I got into his actual diary from the period, it was not, in fact, two men. A few days after murdering the fisherman, they spotted a couple of figures and then got excited because it was a Paiute man and his child, and kids can't run very fast. So he writes about how they were excited because the kid couldn't run very fast, they could probably catch up to them in time. And remember, he did plan to exterminate them all. They were rescued from the attacking Americans. There were a couple of people on horse came out and swept them up before the Americans could get to them. He decided that was probably it and ordered a rest to his men, and then a small group of Paiute cavalry, people on horseback, harried the American invaders, shooting at them from a distance while remaining out of the line of fire until they retreated far enough away. It's possible this was to give the rest of their community time enough to get away from the invading Americans. It's possible this was sort of an inconclusive battle fought for its own sake. I don't know most of the details. I do know that that count of casualties inflicted on the Paiute in this battle is inaccurate, in part because Williams himself claimed that 10 people, his men killed 10 people, and also he provided no evidence. And when he talked about how that had happened, he said, well, we shot a lot of bullets, so we must have killed about 10. And he did have a habit of imagining himself particularly lethal in retreat when no one was there to catch his math. I want to be clear, there were many, many very lethal battles inflicted on Northern Paiute, on Shoshone, on other forces, but there's also a lot of distortions even in the histories that we do have. And I did worry as I was putting this together that I'm sharing mostly stories of people who escaped genocide heirs. Many people did not. There's always kind of a fine balance of speaking to the horrors that are inflicted on Native communities while also recognizing and uplifting survival, right? That Native people survived, they're still here, they'll be here in the future, right? That this is a story of survival as well as a story of loss. But I really wanted to underline that the period of kind of heightened mass killings from 1866 and 1868 are likely a function of better equipment, better scouting, more competent officers, simply more people on the invading side, rather than a fundamental shift. There had been attempts at genocide earlier in the war. They just hadn't been successful in the way that some of Crook's attempts were horrifically successful. I also want to stress, I do this in general when I'm teaching and we talk about colonial conquest, we talk about genocide, and we talk about Native communities in the 1800s more generally. There's no good option for Native persons and communities struggling to survive American empire in the 1800s, especially at this kind of peak period of violence of the 1850s and 1860s, when this was at its height nationwide. Every choice for Native people came with horrible downsides, uncertain advantages, right? Treaty making involves giving up a lot and doesn't always work. Fighting doesn't always work. Scouting doesn't always work. Working with the army doesn't always work. Fleeing, cooperating, resistance. There is no good option, right? Native people were trying to survive. And, you know, certainly we can talk about which choices were not good ideas, which choices did more harm than good, but it's not like there was one magical choice where everything would definitely work out, right? One of the things proving widespread norms of American genocides in the mid-1800s is throw into even sharper relief the hard work done by Indigenous people to survive the violence. The fact that it's so much worse than most histories have said, I think shows just how much work and effort and care went into preserving communities as well as they did. And I think that's also worth keeping in mind when we talk about clashes between Native people. I do think one of the reasons why this isn't as well known in academic circles is that there are sharply different stories about what happened and why it happened. There were clashes between Native communities, as was mentioned in the first part of this evening's presentation. And this was somewhat deliberate. This is a classic tool of empire, especially colonial empire. If you're trying to take land and labor, you divide and exploit the people whose land and labor you're trying to take. And many racist Americans in the Northwest suggested that Native auxiliaries were useful, not only because they were very good scouts, they had familiarity with the terrain, but because they would, as Orlando Humison of the Dalles put it, allow the substitution of Indian risk for white risk, right? That they were seen as expendable by Americans. And some racists, particularly Edmund C. Fitzhugh, liked that, in fact, the use of Native auxiliaries by American forces would lead to more Indians being killed overall, friendly and unfriendly alike, and he was not alone. Other military figures, I want to be clear, did view their Native auxiliaries as soldiers in arms, as fellow comrades. It varies a lot from place to place and person to person, but it's worth keeping in mind that the broader frame was still one of empire. And it's worth keeping in mind that as there was a move towards changing the stories of these wars, there was particularly a move towards erasing American crimes and not erasing or even amplifying stories of violence by Native people on every side. So frequently violence that was being done by American invaders would be pinned on the Native auxiliaries exclusively in those histories. And there too, I think it's important to keep focused, again, not to dismiss very real harms and legacies of damage between communities, but to remember that at the end of the day, this was framed within the broader context of American invasion. When I talk about this, when I talk about the difficulty of recovering these stories, I like to draw on the work of a Coquille member and anthropologist, Dr. George Wasson, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. But one of the things he wrote about was the black hole that was inflicted on his people by the Oregon Holocaust of the 1850s and 1860s, that not only was there this kind of death of people themselves, but that comes with a loss of knowledge, right? A loss of cultural knowledge, a loss of even the knowledge of the extent of what is lost, right? That there is survival, right? He's testament to that survival, right? His family survived. That's part of how he's here to know things, right? Or was here to know things. But that the extent of the loss is such that there will be things we don't know, right? We have to celebrate survival, persistence, and rebuilding without losing track of violence and destruction so vast that it's hard to get a sense of how vast it even is. And I do want to stress, I'm not attacking Oregon specifically in this. This is an Oregon story. It's also a national story. There's a number of scholars, me and some very fancy guys, who have begun to show that this is a peak of American genocide that's sort of been hiding in plain sight through a mix of the kinds of lies and erasures I talk about, and the simple fact that when we talk about the 1850s and the 1860s, the Civil War kind of takes up all the oxygen in the room because it's incredibly important history, but that means we lose the other important stories that are going on. And increasingly, we are trying to reckon with this as the peak of the kinds of violence that I've been talking about today. And of course, the Snake War falls right in the center of that peak. Which is to say, this is a problem everywhere, right? And of course, the problem of erasing the violence of pioneers is very much a national story. East, South, Northwest, Midwest, take your pick, right? This is a story that happened everywhere. What is somewhat unusual about Oregon is the breadth of the violence and the depth of the cover-up, right? This was not a secret when it was happening, right? This was known and sometimes celebrated in the mid-1800s. It was talked about in the newspaper. It was in official proclamations from governors, right? Like Lemuel Woods, the governor that was mentioned by the previous speaker. And yet, in the space of a generation, it was almost entirely written out of statewide histories. It disappeared from textbooks. It disappeared from academic histories. When the new Oregon Capitol building was dedicated in 1938, the event was celebrated as Oregon being the one part of the United States obtained by discovery, diplomacy, and peaceful settlement. And it is still routine, right to the present, for even professional historians who supposedly specialize in Indian wars to ignore the brutal wars of the Pacific Northwest. I was just consulting on a big book of all the kind of an attempt at a new history of Indian wars, and they just skipped our whole region. So I had a few choice things to say about that choice by supposed professional historians. And I've heard there might be some tribal interest in renaming this war. That's hard to do, but I certainly see the point. We tend not to use slurs in the official names for things, and we've certainly been renaming geographic features, all sorts of other things that have these horrible names attached to them. I would suggest it might be useful to think about a couple new names, right? Both a new name for the kind of specific set of war acts perpetrated against North Paiute people or against North Paiute and Shoshone, and another to speak to this broad-based war across the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West in this period. Because as mentioned, although those were the groups primarily targeted, many of the perpetrators were targeting any Native person they could find. And I think it's worth having that reflected when we talk about this war. In the meantime, it may be worth as sort of a bridge to highlight that if we're going to call anybody a snake in the snake war, it's people like Lauren L. Williams, right? They're the snakes if we're going to start calling people snakes in this war. I want to zoom out a little bit more and talk a little bit about how we have missed this story for so long, and maybe one of the problems we have as historians, how some of the would-be historians who've written some of these histories of the snake war have maybe been led astray. And that has to do maybe with the interaction of empathy and sympathy, both of which are important, right? Empathy is the essential tool for a historian. If you want to think about history, you have to imagine life as somebody other than yourself, right? Often very different from yourself, because they also lived in a different time in addition to not being you. Sympathy is natural to follow. It's human. It's often good. It's a danger when sympathy overrides our reading of the historical evidence, right? Most monsters historically have been humans with hopes and dreams. You spend a lot of time with a person. I spent days reading through Lauren L. Williams' records. When he's complaining about his aches and pains, I feel sympathy. I too have aches and pains, right? I too have a tricky knee. But letting that sympathy ooze too much into your narrative where it starts distorting historical facts can be a real issue. And frankly, there have been histories of the Snake War that have been written by historians who desperately wanted to think the best of the American invaders who fought in it, and whose reading of the evidence was fatally flawed by that desire. They wanted American heroes, and they made them even though the evidence doesn't support it. There were heroes in the Snake War. They weren't the people who were fighting against the Paiute, right? They were the upstanders. There were the American heroes in this are those who were trying to stop it from happening. And I do want to know, it's really hard to deal with lies. History is hard enough, right? It's already incredibly difficult. We already don't have most records from the past. And when you add on, now you have to think about whether people are lying. It's really, really difficult. And so I understand why some historians don't want to do it. But as I sometimes say to my classes, do you think politicians lie sometimes? Do you think that ever happens? Do you think that started 20 years ago, right? Of course politicians lie sometimes. Of course that's true in the past. And yet there's this habit of somewhere around 100 years ago, we just treat all politicians as if they're telling the truth, right? And of course, really, that's not just politicians, right? Of course, history is full of untruths, and some of those untruths are deliberate lies. And sometimes if we read enough stuff, if we're careful, we can prove it. We can show it, and that needs to shape how we talk about the past. I also recognize that what a lot of people want from history is heroes, and that's okay. I like heroes too, right? We should find inspiration in figures in the past. We are not stuck with whoever we found inspiration from before, right? They don't have to be the same people over time. If you were in America in 1775, the hero par excellence was King George III. There's a statue of him up in your town square. A couple of years later, not so much, right? That's dunked in the bay. You've picked new heroes. We can do that again, right? And one of the things I'm hoping to do as we show the dark sides of many of the leading figures of Oregon is also bring out those who show better sides of humanity. Native leaders, Chehalis leader Kulayuanan, I've been able to show some very cool evidence of how he preserved his people and others, but also everyday Americans. There's an upstander named John Beeson, who's a relatively obscure figure, but who devoted his life to trying to stop the horrors that had happened in Oregon from happening nationally. Right? And I would rather have him be the person that we talk about as a positive pioneer in schools than like Crook. I also think it's worth noting that this is painful, right? This is difficult history. New narratives are hard, and especially new narratives are hard when we're talking about pioneering more broadly. Most of the individual pioneers I talk about are not beloved. There are very few people who have a deep emotional attachment to Lauryn L. Williams. Nobody's heard of the guy. Joseph Lane, who's a big famous Oregonian, nobody really cares about Joseph Lane, right? When I tell about his crimes, people decide, oh, I don't like that guy. It's harder to give up the broader idea of blameless pioneers, right? It's harder to give up the idea that people were blameless folks coming to empty land. But I can tell you, as somebody who's read literally hundreds of thousands of pages, a majority of the pioneers, a pretty strong majority, knew whose land they were taking and were comfortable, or at least comfortable enough with the violence that was being used to get it. And that's going to be a painful narrative to confront, right? These are our Confederates here in the West, right? That's painful and difficult. It takes courage to do that. And I think we need to do it. I also think that part of studying lies is to show the truth, right? If you want to show why the narrative of a place like Oregon is so much different than what we thought before, one of the ways to do that is by underlining why it is that we got a narrative that is incorrect. And of course, we're in a period of profound assault on fact-based history. We're in the first period in my life where factuality is not a defense for history teachers in several states, which as somebody who's training future social studies teachers has been a terrifying and fascinating change where there are multiple states where fact is not a defense anymore. We have been through this before in the United States. We went through a version of this in the 1950s. We went through a version of this in the 1920s. But it feels unprecedented in part because we've gotten so much better at historical truth since the 1950s and certainly since the 1920s. And yet I have faith that Americans have the mental fortitude to work through honest history even when it's hard, rather than live in a fantasy world where Americans in the past never did anything wrong. And I do think part of getting to that is showing how and why people learned to lie. Because to me, history is not just something I do for fun or because I'm interested in the past or because I like reading dead people's mail, right? The point of learning and teaching history is to make tomorrow better than yesterday. And for me, we should hope that future generations are an improvement on us and strive to be an improvement where we can on previous generations. I'm going to end with a few quotations that I care for from people who are much smarter and better leaders than me. I like to use this quotation from Frederick Douglass. I will hold up America to the lightning storm of moral indignation. In doing this, I shall feel myself discharging the duty of a true patriot, for he is a lover of his country who rebukes and does not excuse its sins. And I refuse a vision of patriotism that doesn't involve changing your country for the better. And then, of course, given the topic, I thought I would end with a quotation from Sarah Winnemucca, or Winnemucca Hopkins. You who call yourselves the great civilization, you have knelt on Plymouth Rock, covenanting with God to make this land the home of the free and the brave. Ah, then you rise from your bended knees and seizing the welcoming hands of those who are the owners of this land, which you are not. Your carbines rise upon the bleak shore, and your so-called civilization sweeps inland from the ocean wave. But oh my God, leaving its pathway marked by crimson lines of blood and strewed by the bones of two races, the inheritor and the invader, and I am crying out to you for justice. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to answer questions if we have time.
Any questions? I'll hand if you could come up and use the microphone if you have a question, we'll go that way so we can all hear. All right, well, looks like we're good to go. Well, thank you, Dr. Carpenter, for all your help tonight. It's been fantastic. We really appreciate your help. It was
Thank you
really
very
good.
much for having me.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. We're going to do a few things with our pending things. Oh, he's still here.
My question is how much, hate mail and problem does he have on campus or an area where people learn what you're doing?
Would somebody restate that question? I couldn't hear most of it. I'm sorry.
You want to say it in the mic? Yeah.
Yes, he's wondering if you've got any hate mail over this, what you've written, things like that. Is that?
I'm sorry. I'm not hearing. Ooh, maybe is somebody on a computer who can type it?
You can't hear it.
Oh, here, is this better if I stand right here? Okay, so he's wondering if you've had any pushback on what you've been working on or any like hate mail or anything like that.
Yeah, so not as much as I thought. I think mostly it just makes people very sad. I did have a period a few years ago where I was being threatened by neo-Nazis. So that was a lot. I wasn't expecting to have to monitor Stormfront as part of my job to make sure they didn't have my address. But I will say, I think that, I teach in North Dakota. I have students across the political spectrum, and mostly this is just something they don't know, they're horrified by, and they want to learn more, right? I do think this doesn't need to be a point of political division. I'm sure I'll get more, don't get me wrong, but I think this is a kind of history that people don't have that sort of knee-jerk response to in the same way. Or I've just been lucky or haven't heard it.
All right, we have another one.
The archives, where has he found all this information with the archives?
She's wondering, where have you found that information that you used to write this, letters, and what archives have you used?
Yeah, so there's a few giant pioneer archives that were collected at the turn of the 1900s. There's one in Portland, which collected things from all over, and another in Seattle. But I've also gone to some local ones, Baker City, Grand Ronde had one, and there's a big one in Pullman, Washington. But I'd say when archives were first being created, kind of with the dawn of professional history, one of the first things they collected was pioneer diaries, war diaries, pioneer reminiscences. So when we talk about archives, they have call numbers, and frequently those are about 5 numbers long. And I'm looking at like 0008 when I'm doing this. These are often the very first things that were collected as part of the archive. And sometimes I'm the first person who's looked at them in 80 odd years.
All right, we have another one over here.
So I know he said that he doesn't really have like a hard line on this, but like what date would he maybe say would for him be the start of this? And why could we maybe like extend it to like the Modoc War period as well, or what would be the distinction?
Okay, so he's wondering if you had to choose, what would your opening year and closing year be for the Snake War?
If I had to choose, I would probably put it 1862 to 68, but I'd put a lot of context in there to explain how that's not necessarily a great choice, because there absolutely is continuing violence before that and after that, right? But I think that's when you see soldiers being deployed for it in a way that to me implies a move to a formal war footing outside of the sort of quasi-war that had been going on since American arrival.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good night. All right.
So when was the Modoc?
1872 to 73.
Oh, so after